And yeah, so I think we have. I don't know. I don't want to do another full round of introductions. But maybe Gene, maybe if you could just very briefly give us a little bit of your background on the Bible in like a 1 minute thing, and that way some of our folks can kind of just understand. Then we can kind of get going with the subject matter for today. So I'll
Okay.
put you on the spot. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay.
I think I'm not quite sure what you're looking for here. So I'm Jean, and I have been in various Bible studies for many, many years. Some pretty conservative and others not conservative, some Catholic, some non-denominational, and some Lutheran. And so it's, always very interesting to me to learn more about the Bible.
Yeah, and yeah, Gene and Pete definitely come from our former Catholic crew. So very good
Right.
friends of the Thornhills who you met last time. So, all right, so let's get started. We'll start with a brief opening reflection, and then we'll say an opening prayer, and then we'll get into some. We'll start by, I think, actually doing some more of our historical stuff, and then we'll move into just looking into the scriptures themselves. I want to take a lot of time, especially on Genesis 1 and 2, to sort of work through it from the various perspectives we were starting the talk about last week. But so today's class is a little bit different than all the rest, just like last week's was. Today is a little bit more history heavy because I think it's really important before we jump into all these other different types of ways of looking at the scriptures to spend some time sort of reflecting on how we got here, how we got to the place we are where, how to read the Bible is so rife with so much emotion and conflict and disagreement and where that comes from, because it hasn't always been that way. Christians always had something to fight over, but how to read the Bible is only about 150 years worth of fighting, in a way. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And then we're going to, and then in light of that history, we're going to try to look at Genesis 1 and 2 with some of the views or points of view that we talked about last time, right? So that historical perspective, that literary perspective, that simple devotional perspective, and then that perspective of of that all types of different groups of might bring to the text. But so I guess to get started, let's just dig right in to a very frank question that I posed in the syllabus that I sent out, and it starts with "Be blunt." When if you could like summarize in a couple sentences, what are your views on American Christianity today? Hey, Pryor, uh, what would they be? What would it be? What is your when you think of American Christianity today? Give me a quick summary of what that story is in your head.
Yes.
I think I can sum it up in a few words that I've thought about.
Thank you, Carly.
Confusing, abused, and what was the third word I had? Constantly changing.
Okay, so there's a lot of change there. There's a lot of different ideas. I'm assuming that's what you might confuse. And abused, can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that? Sorry.
Well, I think that people use different factions use the Bible to support their themes, whether they be good or bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing that's most upsetting is when you feel that what they're saying is bad and they're using the Bible to support their theme.
Sure. All right. Anyone else? Some initial. Sorry, the wall clock going off.
I think I would say disconnected because of so many different denominations of Christianity that we have, and so many different levels of intensity that people participate in it.
I tried to wait to unmute myself until the wall clock stopped. Yes, after that, yeah, that's absolutely right. So different denominations, but then I mean, also just there's lots of churches that just aren't really part of denominations at this point too, right? And there's very different ideas there. Yeah. So yeah, disjointed, disconnected for sure. I mean, I think you just as a local example, right? I often say like I know the local rabbi and the local imam much better than I know the extremely conservative pastor down the street at Bethel Church, right? I've never met that person, and I talk with the imam and the rabbi on a weekly basis. um, so yeah, for sure. What else? What are other?
I think because my experience has been with more conservative churches for the last couple of decades, almost 3 decades, in the light of the last few years and the things that I've finally realized that the words that come to me are corrupt and self-serving and really far from the life and teachings of Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for being able to name that and put that out there. For sure, and I think it's really important. Just like right, we start our church services with confession and forgiveness, right? To name what's going on in our hearts in order to maybe envision something better. It's important to name these things for sure. Anyone else? Just like
I was gonna piggyback off of Jean. My thoughts were that Christianity is broad, it's vast, it's diverse, but the one thing that I think is sometimes it's misunderstood.
for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's very very misunderstood for sure. I think for whatever reason. So tell me if this sounds right. Like maybe, and it wasn't always this way, but and we'll talk a little bit about this when we get to history. But I think especially over the last few decades, right? When I show up and I'm meeting my peers who are not often regularly churchgoers, and I tell them I'm a pastor, the first things they think about are whether I'm going to judge them and what I think about sex stuff, and if I hate gay people. Like literally, if when I say I'm a pastor at a bar or something, that's where it goes right away.
Mhm.
Also, if I'm allowed to get married, that's always a big one. And I think right, so I think both even for Christians and for folks who are outside of the church, at least to me, what I just put forward, I think is sometimes kind of a popular conception, or a big piece of it, and which is so far from like what the focus of church is for most people, in either direction, no matter what your perspectives are. So, yeah, I don't know. Does that sound about right, Kelly? Or did I?
Yeah, that basically hit the nail on the head. I was, primarily thinking about, people who aren't practicing Christians that kind of pigeonhole us into one. And typically it's Catholic religion. They pigeonhole us all into those beliefs. And so yeah, you had it.
Anyone else? Other thoughts? Thanks for that sharing that. So, if anyone else, I will share one story and then we can keep going. But unless anyone else has anything to add, but to just I think reiterate this, I'll never forget. There was one day when I was on my internship year in New York City, and that was back before there was marriage equality across the country. And I was going to a Lutheran church in Greenwich Village to sort of go to a prayer service for marriage equality, and had my collar on. And it also was a bad day to wear my collar in the subway because it was also St. Patrick's Day weekend, and the and what one like fratty college kid yelled at me, said, "Oh," and he saw my collar, and he said, and the subway car was like filled with people to the brim, and a lot of them were St. Patrick celebrating people. And he yelled, hey, bro, don't think I'm a sodomite. That was the first thing he thought about when he saw someone wearing a collar, right? And of course, I was on my way to a marriage equality vigil, and all that. But yeah, right. And so, um, I think it's important for us to think about, right, as most of us are members or friends of Messiah, at least in some way involved and interested in Christianity. Like, if that is such a part of the popular conception, A, we have a lot of work to do, and B, ask, why is that? How did we get to that point? Because even no matter your theological views, even if you're someone that's extremely conservative minded, you probably don't want people to be thinking about that as the main thing that your religion stands for, right? I would think. But so it's so how did we get here? Is kind of what we'll be talking about today. And anyone else have anything else they want to add, or any other thoughts before we kind of get going into some history stuff? All right. Well, before we get into the 1800s, we're first going to go to the 700s, 500s, and look at Gregory of Nyssa. So, anyone know anything about, and I'll explain why in a second. Anyone know anything about this guy, Gregory of Nyssa? Didn't think so. All right, so he's one of the three fellas called one of what's called the Cappadocian Fathers, who was a central figure in coming up with the Nicene Creed, which is sort of that kind of Pledge of Allegiance-y sort of thing, the fancier one that we read on a few church days a year rather than the Apostles' Creed, right? So literally like the summary of Orthodox Christianity. It's like the statement that that most people would say, this is what it defines. If you believe this, you're a Christian, right? That's what a lot of people say, right? So someone that was not a fringe figure, right? Someone who was not I don't know, a flaming liberal revolutionary or whatever. He's like the core of Orthodox Christianity. Kind of, and here's what he wrote in part in his preface to his interpretation of the Song of Songs. We're not going to go through it all because it's very wordy, but right, this is probably around 500 or 600 CE. Because some members of the church always think it is right to follow the letter of the Holy Scripture and do not take into account the symbolic and allegorical meanings, we must answer those who accuse us of doing so, that is, of using allegory. There is nothing unusual in searching the divinely inspired Scriptures with every means at our disposal. Thus, if the literal sense, as it is called, should be of any use, we will readily have the object of our search. But if anything is hidden, symbolic sense cannot be of use. With regard to the literal sense, we will, as the word teaches and the proverb says, understand the passage either as a parable, a dark saying, an utterance of wise men, or a riddle. So I could keep going on and on. What is this pillar of Orthodox Christianity from 1,500 years ago? What's he saying there, pretty much? What's the gist of what I just read? Can someone translate that into a modern contemporary sentence for me?
I think it's saying the Bible is only one thing, that we have to take a broader look at, what Christianity is all about, that
right.
The Bible is one.
Yes. So yeah, he's saying there's a lot of different genres in here, right? There's a lot of different ways of looking at this. And Song of Songs is a great example. I'm pretty sure it doesn't mention the word God once, right? It's this love poem, sometimes quite explicit love poem, and people have interpreted it in all sorts of different ways throughout history, right? Is it about love, human love, and how God's present in it? Is it an analogy for us becoming closer with God. There's all these sorts of different ways of looking at this. I always tell the story of when I was a camp counselor, well, training camp counselors, training teenagers, and they had a pretend wedding one day, and someone asked me if he could read a Bible verse at his pretend wedding, and I was like, oh yeah. And then, of course, he read something that was very not appropriate from Song of Songs, and it was quite the issue. But point being, friends, right? From the earliest days of Christianity, and I could go through a lot of different people, there's been lots of different ways of reading the Bible and looking at the scriptures. Some people focused on some ways more than others. Things change throughout history. But there's lots of different ways that people that are core to the Christian faith have looked at history. So someone that has or has looked at the Bible. So someone that has experienced more time in a more literalist sort of reading of the scriptures in a community that has read them more. Would someone be willing to share what you were taught about how to read the Bible? I could characterize it, but I never was a member of any of those churches, so I don't know. Amy, Rachel, anyone willing to? Rebecca, I don't know. Anyone willing to share a little bit about how you were taught to read the Bible?
I mean, basically, what the Bible said is exactly what happened. And the point till at the end of the Bible, where it says, like, no one should make shit. I don't know what the exact ending is without going back and reading it, but there's like the last couple lines or something in the Bible says no one should change the Bible or on that line.
Mhm.
So you're pointing out and say, this is specifically saying at the end of the Bible, like you should not, you know what I'm talking about, that very ending?
If you want to read it, yeah, that's fine.
Well, I'm looking for it. Maybe someone else can go in the meantime. I'll look for it. But basically, yeah, that it is what it is. They're not stories. Everything that is in the Bible happened. And it wouldn't be there if God didn't want it.
Right.
And right, and that that the man who wrote it, that the words came from God through man, kind of.
Right. So from God, kind of straight through his fingers, right, and stuff.
I mean, I think that's like that. There's the understanding that a man or a woman, sorry, a man, not a woman, obviously, a man wrote it, but there's this idea that it was still based on what God would have wanted. You put right there.
Cool.
The way that I was raised is that it was inspired by God. So like God kept his word perfect throughout the Bible. So there is no question as to what's true and what's not. And if there's mistakes, it's perfect.
What was the history of that though? Like, I'm assuming people like thought more than one person wrote it over or I literally don't know.
So I was weirdly talking about this with my little sister today, and both of us being like, do you remember learning about the Bible from like a historical context? And both of us were like, no. Like we always learned about the Bible through the Bible. Like you didn't look at it from like a literary sense, a scientific sense, or like a historical sense. It was just the Bible.
Anyone else have something more they want to add? Or Rebecca, jump back in if you find the Bible verse you're speaking about.
I'm still looking for it. I will get back to you as soon as I find it.
Okay, cool.
Something that I realized is the church that we spent a lot of time in talked the way Rachel said about it being the divinely inspired word of God. But the thing I began to hear a lot were the words an orthodox understanding of Christianity. Any questioning, what I began to see is that what was being read wasn't literally always the Bible. You know, the verses that say women shouldn't adorn, have fancy hair and jewelry and those kind of things. That was fine to be really fancy at church. but the verses that said that women couldn't speak or teach anybody older than 10 who was a male, those were really upheld. Verses that talked about how we should behave were clearly not always looked at seriously if there was a leader who we thought was going to advance our political agenda. But other verses were taken really out of context to support a different agenda of marginalizing and discriminating against LGBTQ people. So what I started to understand was that there was absolutely nothing literal about how the Bible was being taken. There was an agenda. There was what they called an orthodox understanding of Christianity was probably, part of what was in that reading.
So, lost you, Amy. Can anyone else? Is everyone else hearing Amy? I'm not. Amy, I think we lost you for a second. I don't know what happened. You're not muted.
I'm not muted. It's saying my
You're
internet
back.
connection's
back.
unstable.
All right, you're back.
Well, I don't know how long I've been blathering on with no sound, but I think maybe you know what I meant.
I got a good piece of it for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I found it.
Go for it.
Okay, so there's a couple areas. The angel, and so it's in Revelations, is basically the very end. So there's a part that says, the angel said to me, these words are trustworthy and true. The Lord, the God of the spirit of the prophet, sent his angel to show his servants the things that must soon take place. Behold, I'm coming soon, and then blah, 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 whatever. And then, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Then it says, the Spirit and the bride say, come. And let him who hears say, come. Okay. Sorry. All right. I warn everyone who hears the word and the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds anything to that, God will add to him the plagues described in the book. And if anyone takes words away from this book of prophecy, God will take away from him his share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which is described in this book. He who testifies to these things says, yes, I am coming soon. Yeah. And so that was sort of like, how you would look at that idea that the Bible says what it says, don't change what it says, or be penalized for it.
Yeah. So that's super helpful. Yeah, and that's interpreted to be saying about the whole Bible, not just the book of Revelation.
Right. I've always taken that to believe that, and maybe impossible if you ask other Christians at my church who been going, like I said, I've been on and off throughout the years, so I don't have necessarily the upbringing of someone who went to the same church for years. Like, so they may have a different look, but that was what I always thought to believe.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that you sharing that, Rebecca, and like what some of those key verses are, because that's actually one I hadn't even, I guess, heard about in part of this conversation before. So I think what I want to say here is, and zooming back to what we learned from good old St. Greg a few minutes ago, it seems to me, from when I talk with a lot of folks who have grown up in faith communities where they've applied a more literalist reading of the scriptures, a lot of the times you hear the word inerrant word of God, right? That there's a story that goes along with it that says this is the way it has always been read, and how dare people change it, right? But if you go back to key pillar of the faith, Gregory of Nyssa, he's talking about all these other ways to read the Bible, 1,500 years earlier. The idea of this literal only way of reading the Bible, in fact, from my perspective, and that's what we're going to be talking about in terms of history, is a fairly modern idea too. And it's a modern idea that's a reaction to another somewhat modern idea of of the Enlightenment, right? Of learning about things through the scientific revolution. Even though for a lot of history, we often have this other story in our heads, right? That science and faith are at loggerheads, right? Does that sound like something you hear sometimes? Um, let's see here. As an example, anyone know who that guy is? You can probably see it. Sir Isaac Newton. Now, probably, most of these works weren't published until after his death, but he wrote way more about theology than he wrote about science, right? Now, he probably would have been somewhat, he was kind of against the Trinity and probably would have been seen as heretical by some, but he was really, really deeply interested in theology, and his study of science, right, coming up with gravity and along with another guy, calculus, like grew out of his, oh, God created the world and I want to understand how God's world works, rather than wasn't seen as a loggerheads. And there's countless examples of folks like that throughout history, and not even in just the Christian world. That's another discussion for another day. But all these sort of stories we have in our head, that there's only been one way to read the Bible from the beginning, that science and faith are kind of seen as enemies of one another. They're all really grow out of a lot of things that really started back in the late 1800s, and actually in part somewhat right here in upstate New York. And this part of this discussion is very similar to what a few of you participated in last spring, when the very last class. So there's some overlap here, but a big part of this too is, how does the world end, right? And it's people reacting to changes in their society. So mid 1800s, late 1800s is really when a lot of different kind of scientific things are taking off, right? That's when Darwin comes out then. Right, you're also seeing the rise of industrialization, and people are flocking from in the Western world, flocking from living on farms and whatever, into more complicated city life. But you're also seeing the negative sides of the industrial evolution, right? You're seeing by the time you get to later in the 1800s, it's the Gilded Age, right? The robber barons and these times of massive inequality, and kids working in factories, and all this rapid change. And that in turn, because people are stressed out, stirs religious change. Has everyone here heard of the Great Awakening? Right? I know I talked a lot more about the other aspects of the Great Awakening in the previous course, but we're talking about kind of the flip side of it here. So this guy, a famous upstate New Yorker, William Miller. Anyone ever watch the show The Leftovers? It's an HBO show about the end of the world. Okay, a few people. It's really good. It shows this scene at the beginning of the third season, I think, where all these people are standing on their roofs in like a forested village area and waiting for God to take them off the roof because the world's going to end. That happened here in upstate New York. They were called Millerites. And that guy, it was his idea that he looked at the Bible and counted the literal interpretation and thought the world was going to end on one day. Of course, that didn't happen. Then he calculated another day and said he got it wrong. That didn't happen. But there's a lot of this sort of apocalyptic furor that's a piece, not all, but a piece of that Second Great Awakening. And you also begin to see more and more science that's not in the Bible that answers different questions begins to sort of slowly, come into, as public schooling is getting to be a bigger thing too, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on there, and you also are starting to see people applying the earliest sort of scientific methods to understanding the Bible. we're beginning to discover some like archaeological stuff, right? Oh, that affects what we understand of how the scriptures are going to be. We begin to really more carefully look at the scriptures and see that the voice of the author in this one place is really different than the voice of the author in the same book, but in this different place. Why might that be? And so folks are beginning to come out with these really, and they were innovative ideas of how to understand the scriptures. And then what happens is you start to get a crew of leaders, including with folks like that guy Miller, and another guy, John Nelson Darby is another great example. And they get together. The camp meetings are becoming a big thing. And there's this one thing called the Niagara Conference that happens on the Canadian side of Lake Ontario, and where a lot of these folks get together and they begin to develop what they really want to define as the fundamentals of the Christian faith. And that's not, and I don't think it's really about, it's for no nefarious purposes, right? Like, how do we, in a society where, unlike today where, almost half of folks have a college degree in America, right? Like, how do we describe the basics as an evangelical, how do we, to people that don't know about Christianity before, right? How do we get the word out? And they begin to try to define, in somewhat in response to these new ideas, the key tenets of the faith, and that's where we begin to get this sort of idea of this is the only way to read the Bible. That gets even bigger as we get into the later portion of the 1800s and early 1900s. So Princeton Seminary at the time is sort of a hotbed of kind of literalist thinkers. And they work together. I'm going to pull up to get the date right, to publish a series of essays published between 1910 and 1915 called "The Fundamentals: A Testimony to the Truth." These essays, right, were written by so many of the leading theologians of the day, and they talk about how a Christian should interpret evolution and how what are the key tenets of our faith, and they're mailed out to like every single Sunday school in the country, every single YMCA in the country, which were at the time actually kind of a bed of Christian socialism, and every church in the country in different ways, right? And so that's really when they have this kind of millennialist end of the world piece to it, and this super literalist piece to it. And that's all coming in the midst of, by that point, you get to the early progressive era, right, where people are really starting to push for women's right to vote. There's a lot of other changes, think about what's happening in the early 1900s as well. And so that's when you really develop what's called this modernist fundamentalist controversy, especially in an American context, but it's gone throughout the world. And we'll get into how it's progressed, but that's where this argument really develops and really gets a lot stronger than it's been. It's not been a 2,000-year-old argument. It's about 110 years old or so. I just covered a lot of information. Any questions or thoughts or reactions to what I just put forward? And you can read pretty much everything I just told you on that Encyclopedia Britannica article. But
just a quick observation.
yeah,
The modernist controversy also hit the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
In Rome, so it prevented for a number of years an historical, literal reading of the Scripture. And that really held forth until almost the beginning of Vatican II. I mean, there were scholars that were breaking the rules and doing it differently, but there was not kind of any authorization for doing that until Vatican II.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good, important point to make. Yeah, this is not just a Protestant thing. Anyone, other thoughts or questions? You're going to get to watch a video and not stop listening to me blab in a minute. All right. Cool. So that's the kind of this early context, and then we get to the infamous Scopes monkey trial. Anyone ever hear about that? Few people. Oh, it's one of the most interesting things in history. I think. I love it. It really, I think, describes what we are today. I found a 7-minute version of the story of Scopes monkey trial that we're gonna watch now, and then we can talk more about it. And this is really a turning point, and where this argument.
Hello, welcome to AP Sources Simplified. Today we're looking at the famous 1925 Scopes monkey trial. Before getting into the details of the trial, let's take a look at the context. The progressive era, lasting from roughly 1900 to 1920, had seen great reforms sweep across the country as progressives tackled a myriad of societal issues. It culminated with the 19th Amendment, the women's right to vote, in 1920. However, the rest of the 1920s would see a resurgence of conservatism. Some see the 1920s as an era of liberalism with flappers, speakeasies, and jazz. And that was true in the big cities. But for most of America, the 20s saw conservative forces reestablished. First, conservative governments were voted in on the state and national levels, which kicked out many of the progressives. And conservatives brought back a friendlier government to big business and also social conservatism. The Ku Klux Klan had a resurgence across the entire nation, with even northern states having large chapters of Klan members, of which there were members of Congress involved with. This set up a culture war between modernists and fundamentalists that engulfed everything from debates over prohibition, jazz music, immigration, consumerism, and our focus in this video, evolution. The topic of evolution and natural selection goes back to the mid to late 1800s with Charles Darwin's writings. It had been applied to society in something called social Darwinism, in which the elites tried to employ as justification for their wealth and status, which they argued meant that they were more fit than others. Biologists and others attempted to track humans to their origins, with many concluding that humans must have evolved from monkeys or apes. This flew right into the face of those who were more religious and believed the literal interpretation of the Bible, including the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. In more religious parts of the country like Tennessee, laws were passed that forbade the teaching of evolution in public schools. The specific act Tennessee passed was called the Butler Act. The nonprofit group, the American Civil Liberties Union, also known as the ACLU, wanted to challenge the law. This is where the namesake of the trial steps in, John T. Scopes, a young football coach from Rhea County High School in Dayton, Tennessee. He substitute taught from time to time, and he agreed to be the ACLU's test subject. Fun fact, the school district was in on this scheme as they thought it would bring notoriety to the city, which it did. John T. Scopes was only looking at a $100 fine, but the fine was not the point of the case. The point was to challenge the Butler Act, which would set up an arena for the modernists and fundamentalists to square off. High-profile lawyers and individuals came on board the legal teams for both the prosecution and the defense. Leading the defense team was famous lawyer Clarence Darrow, who had already built up an incredible resume as a lawyer. The prosecution side features several prominent individuals, but none more so than William Jennings Bryan, former populist and Democratic presidential candidate. He was a central figure of the fundamentalist side. When the trial began, the defense team of Scopes knew they had their work cut out for them as the deck seemed stacked against them, with an obviously biased judge who quoted Bible verses during the trial. Darrow and his team had a masterful defense of Scopes from a variety of points. One of those was, how could a teacher be reprimanded for simply teaching what was in the textbook, of which the science textbook of Rhea High School had a full chapter on evolution. There were also other key concerns about academic integrity and freedom. One of the most prominent points in the trial came when defense lawyer Darrow asked William Jennings Bryan to take the stand. Having a day to prepare for the event, Darrow was coached by scientists and others who argued in favor of evolution. When Bryan took the stand, Darrow was able to run rhetorical circles around him, questioning many facets of the Bible as literal truth, like the story of Jonah and the whale and Noah's Ark. When asked about the process of determining when the flood occurred, a frustrated Brian said, quote, "I do not think about things I don't think about," end quote. Of which Darrell replied, quote, "Do you think about things you do think about?" end quote. And Brian replied, quote, "Well, sometimes," end quote. And the courtroom broke out in a derisive laughter. An exasperated Brian said that Darrell was slurring at the Bible. Darrell said that Brian had, quote, "fool ideas that no intelligent Christian on earth believes," end quote. At that, Judge Ralston halted the trial and adjourned the court. The next day, he ruled that Brian's testimony should be stricken from evidence. While it seemed Darrell got the best of Brian, some of Brian's claims would be very influential going forward. One was evolution is scientifically problematic. Another is that evolution undermines morality, society, and religion. And finally, that this position on teaching evolution is supported by considerations like fairness and objectivity. These ideas have been called the pillars of creationism. The arguments from Brian, Darrow, and the entire trial were printed in newspapers and broadcast on radio across the country. Both sides claimed that they had won the debate, and the outcome of the trial became secondary, of which the courts would uphold the Butler Act, while dismissing the fine against Scopes. The act would be law until it was overturned in 1967. Moving on to who would agree and disagree with the ruling. With the ruling going against Scopes and the teaching of evolution,
You get the point.
those that would agree with it would
I
be
gotta find the thing and
fundamentalists
stop
and
it.
many observing Protestants and Catholics, along with conservatives in general. Those that would disagree with the ruling would include modernists, believers of human evolution, some
Awesome. Sorry about that. So it's really hard to find a 5-minute, very fascinating version of this, but it's, I think, a really important thing to talk about. That the Scopes monkey trial was like the first major court case that like gripped the whole country all at once, sort of like OJ in the 90s, right? That sort of thing. It was like this major cultural moment that where people were asking, how is this gonna go? And even though the prosecution won, and the guy supposedly had to pay $100 fine for teaching evolution. Actually, that got pulled out and thrown out in appeals. Essentially, at that point, sort of this more fundamentalist idea of Christianity got publicly embarrassed across the country and repudiated in a massive way. And for a number of years, until probably the mid 60s, and with a lot of changes that happened in the 60s, sort of that the more fundamentalist or literalist readings of scriptures, those parts of Christians really stepped out of the public light for a number of decades in a lot of ways. So what you get, right, in that vacuum is this era of denominations like Lutheranism and a lot of the denominations you think of, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists, a lot of these groups really take center stage in the national understanding of religion, right? So you get on the cover of Time magazine, you get what's his name? Your favorite guy there, Merle. You're muted though. I know you know who. Was it Carl? No, not Carl.
Who are we talking about?
Niebuhr, Reinhold Niebuhr.
Reinhold Niebuhr. Okay.
Yeah, right. So he's a theologian who is really big into talking about ethics and who really thinks about all these different critical ways of reading the Bible. He's on the cover of Time magazine, right? You get obviously MLK grows out of that. You get of that time period, right? You get there's this one picture of President Eisenhower laying the groundstone or the cornerstone of what's now called the God Box in New York City. It's this big skyscraper where like most of the national offices of most of the more open-minded churches and the National Council of Churches until fairly recently had their headquarters, and it was like this this bastion of like sort of Christian or progressive-ish Christianity in America. And that was that was sort of the leading religious voice in America, sort of kind of a more moderate stance for a number of decades, up and through the mid '60s, right? And a lot of major things, along with working with labor, a lot of the major things that we know today, right? All the New Deal programs, all these sort of things, they come out of this era, right after World War II. And so the idea that the story of Christianity in America is conservative thoughts about sexuality is something that's been the case my entire lifetime and a few of your entire lifetimes, but not for everybody. You know, that notion is a relatively a much more recent phenomenon, and there's a reason for it. Any thoughts or questions on some of that I just shared? I know this is a lot of information at once, but is anyone that maybe was alive longer than me? Do you think the public discussion around faith has changed over the last 50 years? I mean,
Sure.
Merle, I want to hear your perspective on this. Yeah.
I mean, sure. You had a series of Supreme Court decisions that about teaching religion, teaching or practicing religion in public schools in the '60s that began to move toward a more secular understanding of how one needs to separate those things out from the curriculum. I want also to point out that the whole creationist version of understanding of humanity didn't die away, but became a fairly sophisticated movement.
Mhm.
And Stephen Jay Gould, who is a paleontologist at Harvard, has a kind of pastime debating these people throughout the country. So Gould probably died about a decade ago, but he was very active in terms of trying to present an alternative to the creationist account. And you know, when I stopped teaching at Siena, I would say, even though the predominant community of students are probably Catholic at Siena, that majority of them in some way or other, I think, came into the college with a kind of creationist perspective. And it was kind of stunning for them to have that challenge their first year in a kind of interdisciplinary course that we provided for them. So I just suggest that some version of fundamentalism is pretty pervasive in our culture, even among fairly secular people.
Yeah, and even amongst like young people in our church, right? I tell the story over and over again. So cousin of a few of our folks here, Hannah, who's wonderful and really into science and really into you know, she took like AP research as like a sophomore in high school. Really a good thinker, you know. She came to confirmation class like one day a couple of years ago, and was like, "This doesn't make any sense to me because here's what I learned about evolution in school." And there's stuff she never heard me say there was any disagreement between evolution and what you read in the Bible, and just the exact opposite. So there's, I think, a popular conception, because it's maybe simpler too, I guess, in people's heads to really think about, like, unless you are naming and showing these other ways of reading the scriptures, it's really easy to think there's just one way. And then when you learn something else, when you learn science, you know, when you go to school and you learn things and then it sounds different than what you're reading in the Bible, well, what do you stop believing?
Let me just say,
you start out, you know.
In my early years in seminary, there were two campus pastors, Lutheran campus pastors, that wrote a book incorporating an evolutionary perspective in science in their discussion. And they were enormously criticized in the wider church. That was the American Lutheran Church based in Minneapolis somewhat more conservative than the East Coast version of the church. But so that was the 1960s.
Yeah.
That was highly controversial in one of the major Lutheran bodies in our country.
That's a really important perspective to lift up too. Anyone? Yeah, Amy, you want to get it? Yeah, go ahead. We got one more
Yeah,
video.
I just don't know. I was not aware until the last bunch of years that most conservative Christian textbooks used by homeschoolers and Christian schools teach a strict 7-day creation as part of science. Entire science books are devoted to it. There is an institute called Answers in Genesis that is all devoted to writing what they call biblical creation, 6-day creation. And the science is completely worked to shape around that story. The age of the earth is told by somebody going through the Bible and counting the generations to decide how many years people have been on the earth, and therefore the earth is that old. And there are classes taught at the churches about intelligent design so that you can speak back to evolution. And there was a debate. I don't know if anybody remembers a debate. Maybe it was 5 years ago. Maybe it was more, between Bill Nye and the head of Answers in Genesis. And I was really interested, thinking, okay, we've got Bill Nye with science. So what is this group going to bring up? And what the Answers in Genesis guy, I can't remember his name, kept bringing up was scripture. And he kept arguing with scripture. And the people in the community we were in the next day, I thought it was kind of like, it was not convincing. It was not convincing at all to me, but people were like, yes, did you hear how, he showed him with the Bible? And it became really clear to me that it was science created to fit the Bible instead of a reading of the Bible that allowed for science to also exist.
We watched that debate
Anyway,
in my
that's still really
last year
happening.
of seminary Bible class, actually live. I remember that very specifically. Yeah.
Oh, the debate?
The Bill Nye, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone have any other thoughts before we continue?
I also am kind of Merrill's age group. I was in college in the 60s, and that is when Vatican II took place, and I grew up in a Catholic home. So my early religious education was not necessarily Bible reading. Catholics didn't really read the Bible. It was kind of interpreted for us. We memorized the catechism and did some of that kind of thing. But I really bought into Vatican II. I really thought that the church had to modernize, that a lot of what they were peddling, I don't think most young people were buying. And I think that's still true today. I think that, some of this dogma, that they're peddling, I think the young people just, look at it and say, not for me.
So I want us to actually spend a half an hour on the Bible, or close to it here. I'm going to cut this over. I really appreciate you sharing that, Harry. And I think that's a really good point too, is that, this insistence on this literal way of reading scriptures in part has really led to the loss of a couple generations now of a lot of folks who otherwise would find faith to be a really meaningful part of life. So the thing, though, is that it's, I think, really important to understand why this is such hotly and deeply held stuff, even more so now than maybe it was back, 50 years ago. So, and so I want us to watch one more quick video discussing a little bit of that history. And that is because really beginning in the late 60s, a lot of these sort of debates that were already out there, they become even more hyper politicized. And my point of showing this following video isn't to at all make arguments about one political party or another, but rather to say that and show how these sort of arguments and ways of reading the scriptures got how they got used by politics, and abused by politics, and they really kind of help us think about that. So I'm gonna shoot 1 second. I need to pull up the right video.
This is
and then we're gonna watch this short video, and then we're actually gonna dig into Genesis itself.
story of the man who helped turn conservative evangelicals into a political force.
I want to talk a little bit about how much our family respects and admires Paul Weyrich.
I want to be like Paul Weyrich when I grow up.
Paul Weyrich has been called the main architect of the religious right. Here he is in 2005.
Those people were not active in politics, and I served as sort of a coach to get them active in the political process.
He also co-founded conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Free Congress Foundation. And he managed to galvanize the evangelical vote around a man who wasn't even an evangelical.
God bless America.
Does that feel familiar? Because a similar thing happened in 2016 with the election of President Donald Trump.
2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17. That's the whole ball game. Is that the one? Is that the one you like? I think that's the one you like because I loved it.
Hey fam, I'm Imayan, and this Sunday, we're going to look at the man behind the evangelical political movement and how it wasn't abortion that created the religious right in the United States. You might have been told that the movement began with Roe v. Wade, but according to Randall Ballmer, a religious historian, it actually began with Paul Weyrich.
One of the most cherished myths of the religious right is that this is a movement that got its origins in reaction to the Roe v. Wade decision. It's a great story. It's been repeated many, many times. It is also utter fiction.
It was Weyrich's calculated effort that made the religious right a political force, and his plan took years to complete.
Conservatives were wandering around lost in the liberal wilderness. And then Paul Weyrich came to Washington.
When Weyrich arrived in Washington, D.C. in the late 1960s, he was to the right of more liberal Republicans, which made him a minority within his own party. Back then, the worlds of religion and politics were largely separate. But Weyrich was determined to change that by courting white evangelicals. The group had retreated from politics after the so-called Scopes monkey trial in 1925, which really centered around teaching evolution in schools. Not only did white evangelicals lose, but they also were humiliated in the public eye.
Paul Weyrich, according to his own account, had been trying since the 1964 presidential campaign to get evangelicals active in politics. He tried everything. He said he tried the school prayer issue, he tried the abortion issue, he tried pornography.
In the end, Weyrich landed on school segregation in the South.
Some carried a doll in a miniature coffin, an effigy of federal Judge Skelly Wright, who ordered the admission of 5 Negro girls to formerly worst grades in New Orleans last week.
And I have to give you a little bit of a backstory first, so please stay with me. In 1970, public schools in 7 states were racially segregated. This was over a decade and a half after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled segregated schools were unconstitutional with its Brown versus Board of Education decision. And Mississippi was one of the states fighting hardest against integration. State leaders claimed that their freedom of choice system allowed Black children to attend white schools. In reality, Black families were subject to intimidation if they tried to enroll. And some white families were so opposed to integration that they abandoned public schools altogether. In Holmes County, Mississippi, there were no white students left in the public school system after just 2 years of desegregation. So where were they all going? Well, between 1966 and 1970, the percentage of private schools in the state rose, and the number of students attending those schools tripled. Most of this growth occurred in Black majority districts.
There were segregation academies, church-sponsored, that were applying for tax-exempt status.
Then in 1969, a group of African-American parents in Holmes County sued the Treasury Department to prevent 3 new segregation academies from getting that tax-exempt status, and they won.
The court ruled that any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable institution.
The following year, President Richard Nixon ordered the IRS to enact new policy denying exemptions to all segregated schools. In 1971, the Green v. Connolly District Court case ruling upheld the new IRS policy, and evangelical leaders didn't like it. which is where Paul Weyrich re-enters our story.
Paul Weyrich finally found the issue that would get the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, Bob Jones Jr., Bob Jones University, and a broader array of evangelical leaders.
Weyrich and Falwell managed to shift the grounds of the debate. They turned it into a conversation about government interference and religious freedom, instead of what it really was, a defense of racist policies. They used the issue to attack Democratic President and evangelical Jimmy Carter, even though it was Republican President Richard Nixon who came down hard on segregation academies. Bob Jones University lost its tax exemption status a year and a day before Carter was inaugurated. So Weyrich had figured out how to win over evangelical leaders. But to win elections, he still needed an issue to get grassroots evangelical voters to the polls. He realized that defending racial discrimination might not be it. Now this is where the abortion debate comes in. Here's Falwell in 1982.
It began in January of '73 when the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade ruled abortion legal on demand.
But pause. Ballmer says evangelical leaders didn't pursue abortion as an issue right away.
Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach against abortion until February of 1978, more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. The key moment for abortion comes in the 1978 midterm elections. Weyrich then resolved that he would go out and elect some improbable people.
Weyrich threw all his effort into getting anti-abortion Republican candidates elected in Minnesota and Iowa.
The final weekend of the campaign, pro-lifers leafleted church parking lots, and 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 Democratic nominees lost to pro-life Republicans.
That's where Weyrich realized abortion was the issue he could use to bring evangelicals to the polls, and maybe even turn them against one of their own, President Jimmy Carter. Before he was elected, Jimmy Carter was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher.
And what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly and to love?
He embodied the idea of progressive evangelicalism and won the presidential election in 1976. In 1979, Falwell created a group called the Moral Majority, but the term was actually coined by Weyrich. The Moral Majority declared war on abortion and homosexuality. Then the group enlisted the help of Francis A. Schaeffer. Schaeffer worked with C. Everett Koop to produce a series of films called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and toured the country screening them for evangelical audiences. Here's what the films looked like.
The fact that human life is being devaluated is demonstrated by some of the major issues which are being debated by society today. Abortion, infanticide, euthanasia.
And as that series of films begins to travel and circulate across North America, evangelicals become finally attuned to the abortion issue in advance of the 1980 presidential campaign.
Ronald Reagan courted conservative evangelicals, and he won their support despite the fact that he...
Stop it before I minimize my screen, share my screen at this time. So that's a lot of I'm not good. That's a lot of history and a lot of politics stuff. The point of this is not to make a point one way or the other about abortion. The point of this is not to make a point about politics, for sure. I couldn't be more furious in a lot of ways with some of our national elected officials right now who are Democratic, right? So that's not the point of this. But the point of this is to share how this issue that had been growing for 50 years and had kind of in some ways fallen under by the late 60s in response to issues of race and specifically segregation of these private Christian academies gets weaponized and exacerbated for, up into the present. That's how we get to where we are today, right? These folks that were at a Bible conference 120 years ago, trying to come up with the fundamentals, not doing anything nefarious as far as I know, right? Trying to make a simple understanding of how to read the Bible for everybody. And then this whole process we get to today. So any thoughts or questions on all of that? I want us to actually look at the scriptures briefly. But I know that's a lot to pack in all at once.
I think just a quick observation. Randall Bowman and others correctly said, it's white evangelical.
Yes,
Because the evangelical movement incorporates most Black Christians.
right.
So we're talking about a particular division within the evangelical movement. We're talking about this movement now.
Anyone else have any questions or thoughts? Was that shocking to see some of those connections? Was it surprising? I gotta figure out how to turn that wall clock off. A reason that this is so heightened and so heavy today, right? And it's because a lot of these issues have been co-opted by, and there's other ways, other political parties have used these things too, in other ways. But there's a reason where all this comes from, and a lot of it does stem from kind of trying to what's called the Southern strategy in reaction to the civil rights movement of the 60s. Let's look at a different way to read the Bible. How about that as before we wrap up? So, who had the opportunity to read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? And if so some of you, was anything super different from what you remembered? And we're going to actually look at the text themselves in a second, but what did anything strike people as, oh, that's different than I remember?
It was different than I remembered it a little bit. Like, I just remember it being like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1 or so, whatever. It actually was more serious than I remembered it, in a way. I remembered it being like this very like a childhood story, kind of the way it sounds, probably because it's how they teach it to you when you're that young, and so that's how I remembered it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A really important point to make for some of our younger parents watching this, right? Like that image you see in the Genesis Bible story, right? That really sticks there. It really sticks, even as a small child. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Rebecca. And anyone else have any other initial reactions to Genesis 1 and 2?
My initial reaction was, it's been a while since I read it, but in Genesis 2 was another account of creation. And it's funny because I don't remember that. I remember Genesis 1 as the account, the story of creation. So it was interesting to revisit that.
Yeah. Now the titles have been added in later, to be fair, but that's a really key point, though. Still, that's not a part of the original text. But that doesn't. I mean, so I wonder when you look at the text, like the style of writing changes right below that subtitle, right? Does anyone notice anything kind of different?
Well, I noticed that in Genesis 1, I used the I, and I substituted I for God. And in Genesis 2, you can't do that because Genesis 2 is being told as a story by someone else. Where in Genesis 1, God is telling the story. So I'm telling the story.
Told from a different person's perspective, or a different perspective. Yeah, for sure. That's really true. Anyone else notice anything else that was kind of super different?
I feel like Genesis 1 is a little bit more general. And in Genesis 2, we get down to like, you get all the names of the rivers. It gets a little bit more specific.
It gets a little more like kind of earthy, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, for sure. Right. So we're gonna practice or give you a little bit of a taste of what it means. So to look at these scriptures from a couple different perspectives. So we started. So let's just talk a little bit about history. Who here has seen the new Eternals movie? No one? Rachel has because she watched it with me when we were sick with COVID. Oh, well, this won't be have as many connections, but it's fine. So I don't think this isn't a spoiler because it starts right at the beginning. In the beginning of the Eternals movie.
I'm 20 minutes into it.
Okay, Matt, then you already have heard about Tiamat?
Yes.
Okay, good. Then we're fine. So Tiamat is this sort of god thing called a whatever they're called that is being born in the earth, and it's gonna break in half. And that the name Tiamat comes from another creation story that was followed by the Babylonians in this scripture, in this other type of scripture called the Enuma Elish. And in that story, Tiamat or the god Marduk slices Tiamat in half to make the world. Now, why does that matter? That matters a lot because I could go into a lot of detail about why, but especially the first Genesis story in Genesis 1 was probably written by what's called the priestly source. So there's a lot of different ideas about this, but essentially, a lot of especially the first 5 books of the Bible, kind of have 4 different perspectives that have seemingly been combined together. The priestly one being written while the people of Israel were either in exile or shortly thereafter in Babylon, right? And so let's look at Genesis 1 itself. So, right, like literally the Enuma Elish kind of begins just like this. There's God, there's waters, and then eventually Tiamat gets sliced in half. How is this story different? Is there any violence whatsoever? In Genesis 1. The answer is no, there's not. As far as I know. There's lots of blessing. God takes a nap on the 7th day. Right? It talks about creating humankind in our image, which I think is I always love that it's a plural there. And there's blessing. What happens at the end of each day? And God saw it was good. God saw the light was good. Right? It was good over and over and over again. Is talking about the goodness of creation. The point of that story, right, isn't to fight about whether or not we're from monkeys. Right? It was written in a time where people were either exiled or just coming back from exile in Babylon, and that it was a critique of the culture that the violent culture that had subjugated them, right, and kept them for a couple for generations away from their homeland. And over and over again, it affirms the goodness of God and the goodness of God in creation, and the fact that we as people are in some ways have a reflection of that image of God. And when you think a little bit about from the historical perspective, and when you look at it from a literary perspective, which is sort of what is the point of this story, is the point to make a specific, this is exactly how it doesn't read like, it just doesn't read like that. It doesn't read like a history book. I don't think. I don't know, any comments on that, any thoughts on that, or any verses in particular? I want to flesh out more. Anything surprising?
It feels
much more helpful story to our day and age than how the world was created, I guess, for me anyways.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So we'll be talking about kind of an eco-theological perspective on the scriptures the whole time next time. We're done with all the history and monkey trials and stuff, right? So, but yeah, so we'll flesh that out a lot more next time. But absolutely, right? Like, so in terms of like environmental stuff, or do you mean other issues of our day, or like?
No, just in like it's just like more like thinking of ourselves in like the form of God and good. I don't know, I feel like I feel like there's so much shame and there's so much like judgment within the church, and like I feel like right from the get-go this is just like you are good and like this is good, and I just feel like that, I don't know, it's just more, it makes a bigger impact than like this is how the world was created.
Yeah, okay. I really get you. Anyone else want to add to that, or any other thoughts on that? Really appreciate that.
I was just going to say that I think the brevity for me of the story kind of speaks to how it doesn't actually try to explain anything. And I feel that if it were trying to explain something, we'd probably get a bigger, broader story on it.
Yeah.
It's
a really good point from a literary perspective. It just doesn't seem like that's really the point it's trying to make. It doesn't spend time on the specifics of like what was being moved that day. It just keeps saying it's good over and over and over again.
I mean, I'm sorry. I guess I've seen it a little differently.
Sure.
What it is exactly telling you like what's being done every day. I mean, maybe not like one specific animal or like what or like what plant, but I mean, it's telling you like each day what is happening, and I guess if you're not going to read it as it is, why write it at all? I mean, why is it there if not to explain like how God began in a way?
I don't know, Rachel, I don't want to put you on the spot, and if you don't feel comfortable answering, it's fine, but like, what would you were talking about that it means more for us from the perspective we were just saying, so why do you think it was written then? Rachel.
Say that one more time. For some reason my phone makes you really low,
which is weird since we're in the same house, but
yeah.
You're on the internet. Why, like, from your perspective, why would you imagine why this was written if it's not to say this is how it happened?
I mean, so I feel like that's like not an easy answer. And I think that I feel like it's a very personal question, I guess. I think that it's, for me, I guess I stopped looking at it as a more literal. I don't know if I'm answering this correctly.
So tell me if this sounds right. I mean, for me too, the point of the story is not. Is much more to say. Talk about how God is present in creation, or reflected in creation. The goodness of God is reflected in creation and in people, rather than this is how it happened. Right.
Like, I guess I don't think of the Bible as like I feel like it's not like it's not meant to be a scientific book. I feel like I don't think that that's why we read it. I think that it's more powerful as a book of wisdom, as a book of telling of a way of like, oh,
Bless you.
sorry. I don't know. It just doesn't mean anything to me as like a scientific book. And I feel like that's not what they're trying to create out of the Bible. Like they're not, I don't know. I feel like I'm not making sense
No,
anymore.
I appreciate that. Anyone else want to maybe try to voice their opinion about what the point is? Amy, or thoughts?
I was thinking about the fact that this was likely an oral tradition, right? That most cultures had an oral tradition that would explain their origin stories. And when you think about it as an oral tradition, you can kind of hear the repetition. This happened and it was good, and this happened and it was good. And so that point that you're making about it being good, it seems like in the oral tradition with the repetition, that would be what they were trying to underscore. God did this and it was good. And it's cyclic with what happens one day and the next day and the next day. And there's a lot that isn't in there. And I've heard it pointed out that dawn and dusk aren't in there. Shores aren't in there. There's water and dry land, but there are also seashores. It's not, I don't think, meant to be a book that contains all the things about all creation and all creatures and all humans and all sexuality and all gender. But I think it's a story that was part of an oral tradition that introduced people to the idea that God made them and God made creation and it was good.
Remember, it was written by this supposedly priestly source too, is what we were talking. So to me, it almost sounds like a liturgy.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. But it's priestly liturgy is a good perspective, I think. Yeah,
like the back and forth we would do in a church is reflected. I don't know if that helps at all, Rebecca, in terms of hearing a couple other thoughts. I want to spend a couple minutes on Genesis 2 quickly, though, if that's okay.
I mean, that's fine. I don't think it really, I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure if I can understand it. Like, it still comes back to then, did he do these things or did he not do these things? And then if we're looking at it from that viewpoint, then what's not to say that people just created this story, as a way of telling us how to live our lives and what they thought was how we should live our lives. But I see what you, but I also don't want to take up time on just my question, and maybe it's something that can be revisited another time.
Yeah, and we're going to keep looking back at this similar stuff every single week, too, as we look at other texts, for sure. And so I do appreciate you. I really love that you're voicing these questions, because I think it's important and for all of us to grow in understanding, for sure. When we look at, we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes, if that's okay. When we look at Genesis 2, so we talked about the earthiness and the specifics, some specifics about what's going on with the different rivers and stuff like that. Was there anything else that stuck out to folks as either different from what they remembered or particularly meaningful? So here's a big one. They don't even have it's a different word for God. It doesn't really play well in our English translation, right? But so right, if you so whenever Lord is here, spelled like that in the Old Testament, it's standing in for the Hebrew word, and because you don't say it from a Jewish perspective, Yahweh, right? You don't say the name of God. But where it says Lord God in the Bible, it's really standing in for that name of God. Whereas in Genesis 1, I had like literally the Hebrew pulled up, but it's Elohim. So it's literally a different name for God from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, which is kind of interesting. But what else is sticking out here? Anything? Was where is it? So it's 7. Okay.
You don't have the days.
Say that again.
You don't have the days.
The days aren't there, right? Yeah, the days aren't there. For sure. So I think one thing that's really important here. Where is it? I'm trying to figure out where he names them. So right. So this is God forms man in the dust of the ground and breathes life to him. So right, literally God is creates the man from the dust, right? Where does he name him Adam and Eve? Where'd that come? Is that later on? I'm trying to make one key point here. Is that in the next chapter? Yeah, okay.
So when you're asking about Eve,
Where is he? I'm trying to find where he names him Adam and Eve, or supposedly names him Adam and Eve. It's
I don't remember reading that in the chat in the reading.
Where is it? Huh. Well, anyway, wherever that is, let me see. Adam. It's in chapter 3. Well, this translates it as the man. That's what's messing us up. So that whole argument about it was Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? You've heard that thing, right? So the word it literally just means man, and it's really man and woman. The literal meaning of the word Adam or Ha-Adam in Hebrew is of the earth, right? So earth, or creature of the earth. So earth creature. And so it's it's not like it wasn't meant to be a was it personal not personal formal noun or whatever that term is. I can't remember right. It's not meant to be a name of a specific person, right? Like Adam walking down the street here in 21st century America. It's meant to say that, right, we are literally of the earth. We are created of the earth in some way, and which would make sense because the Genesis 2 probably is pulled from what's called the Yahweh source, right? So all the parts of the Hebrew Bible that call God Yahweh, and it was probably the earliest source where people are a much more thinking from an agricultural perspective. There's a lot less city life. It's not the same concerns as the concerns of the priests, right? So the priests wrote the liturgy version of it later on, and then you have this other story where, right, these are farmers trying to feed their families, and these especially even earlier oral traditions of talking about that we come from the earth in some way, and so I think so for me here, similarly, right, especially in a society that has become so detached from creation in a lot of ways, the point of the story for me is it really talks about we are literally of this earth, right? We're made of the same stuff, like and that's a really, I think, important thing as we think about climate, as we think about all sorts of pollution and endangered species and all these sort of things that in some ways that the same stuff that everyone and everything is made out of. The same thing that Rachel's lovely dog Ellie is made out of. We're all made of the same stuff. And there's some commonality there and connection that we need to deeply foster and grow in. So for me, that's the point of the of Genesis 2 especially. But anyone else, what do you think it's trying to say, I guess? Anyone else have any thoughts on Genesis 2 more especially?
I always thought as Genesis 2 is an introduction to original sin.
You get on there in 3.
Oh, that's in 3?
Yeah. I should have
But
said
it's
Oh,
the
there
same
we
story.
go.
It's the same story, Carly. Just continues on. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No, but in a way, it's sort of introducing that idea because it's starting out with how amazing everything is, and all you have to do to have this amazing thing is not do one thing, right? I mean, it's setting you up for the beauty of everything, and then it goes in later where you start talking about the original sin and what you could have had if man wasn't so like had that flaw of, I guess, wanting to do more, or like I guess the flaw of sin in a way of doing exactly what you're told not to do. You know what I mean? So even though it's not talking about it yet, I feel like it's setting it up so that we can then see what we lose from committing the original sin. Does that make sense?
So Genesis 2 stories is a I mean, and I think you're absolutely right in some way, Rebecca, that it's clearly, especially when you get into Genesis 3, trying to talk about, well, God created this perfect, beautiful place, and what the heck happened? There's evil in the world, right? In some way or the other. Now, it's now, how that evil enters in, there's different ways of interpreting it. So one thing that's really important for us sort of Protestants to think is that the whole original sin idea of interpretation of Genesis, that comes 400 years into Christianity for the first time or so. So Augustine is the original person who kind of comes up with that interpretation of Genesis.
Paul may have thinks it did.
I don't know. There's a debate on that. But
yeah.
But point being, if you asked, it's not like, so if you ask Jewish folks who have this as their scriptures today too, right? That's not the point of the Genesis story. That's original sin is just not a concept in Judaism. Neither is, well, in most ways, neither is Satan for the most part. And Satan's not there. It's just a serpent. If you look at the story, it's just a serpent, and it doesn't specifically say it's an apple either. So, but without a doubt, I think this question of how can this good creation, and right, the Genesis 2, that both stories are trying to make a point that God's creation is good in different ways, but trying to make that point. This deep question, and perhaps the question, why is there so much evil in the world? Right, and it tries to explore that, and it tries to explore why as individual people and as societies can we never seem to quite get it right. It absolutely is exploring those things without a doubt. And I think, friends, for me, a really great summary of really how to think about the whole Bible is and to me, why it's so much more powerful to think about it as the voices of God working through the voices of different people throughout the centuries, and knowing a little bit about the historical context, is just like I am today, sitting at home in quarantine of this virus that's been going on for 2 years and has been getting in the way of me hanging out with a lot of your kids in Sunday school, and and all the normal things that I would love to spend my time doing as a pastor, and so frustrated about the way the world is. And I'm asking God, how are you present in this? the whole Bible is a chronicle of different people of other really difficult, living in really difficult times, probably far different than the times we're living in, struggling with those very same questions. How is God present in this? What is the meaning of all this? And so to me, I think that is a much deeper and more important question than this is the story of how this exact thing happened to these exact people these exact number of years ago. It's that why that we all are I know I'm at least struggling with today. I don't know, any thoughts on it? What thoughts on
A question I have that you probably don't want to take the time to answer right now, but might be worth throwing out there for as we go on is, you know, what do you do when you take into account the culture that this was the story of a patriarchal group of people, and from the get-go, we assume the first person created was male. The female was created to serve the male, and the female gets the blame for the downfall of this paradise. And so that's been used in pretty damaging ways throughout the history of the church. And I guess I just wonder what you do with, you know, when you're looking for the general themes like God is good. You know, what do you do with that kind of cultural context that puts some pretty big messages in there that have been used through the years?
So we're definitely going to be, and we can definitely circle back to the creation or the second creation story when we get to our we'll have one night that just kind of where we can dip our toes in the waters of sort of feminist and womanist perspectives on reading the scriptures, and it's super, super important because these texts have been used for justify all sorts of things, and so I think we can definitely spend some more time on that there. But that's a real I think that's a very final point that I would want to make too, Amy, is that to me it's more compelling that God is working through other imperfect people like me to put these stories out here, imperfect people who are part of the culture of their times, and still I think putting forward some really good stuff and some really important stuff, right? Just like, I don't know, I hope that God works through me, and I am wrong about lots of things in lots of ways, and I bet I could name a lot of other things. When it's really weird in a world where you have like 5 or 6 years of your sermons on tape, like there's stuff that I look back 5 years ago that I said, like, what the heck did I say that way, right? Do I, it's a core part of my belief in what I do that somehow God's word is coming through what I say in the pulpit every Sunday. And so to me, it's a really compelling thing that the good news of from a Christian perspective of Jesus is coming through the writings of imperfect people, just like how I hope that God is somehow speaking through what I do and what we all do in our faith life, right? But yeah, the culture of the time really, really matters, and there's a lot also, and we'll learn about this more in a couple times, like a lot about kind of the biblical understandings of gender that are incredibly liberating too, and were incredibly progressive for their time too. But those texts are oftentimes ignored or translated in different ways, or so on and so forth. As just one example, right? When the word say prophets is translated from the Hebrew, that Hebrew word usually means it's the gender neutral plural, right? So it's prophets of all genders. But when we hear the word prophet and don't hear prophetess in English, right, we think they're only dudes. So there's there's a lot of that throughout the scriptures that we'll be talking about in a couple classes coming up. Any other final thoughts? We're running 13 minutes late.
We don't have access to it now, but apparently the The New Revised Standard Version has made some further corrections in terms of gender issues. So whenever we have access to that, that'll give us a further work of biblical scripture scholars to help us genderize some of those issues.
Yeah, I think it's right. We're reading this. We're all reading the scriptures in one of the few major languages that I know of that doesn't have a third gender to the word, right? Anyone else? Any final thoughts or things they're taken away from today? Cool.
It's a very simple thing, but I think what you pointed out. So Genesis 2 was earlier than Genesis 1.
Yes.
Clearly, Genesis 1 was layered onto a story that is a longer story in Genesis 2 beyond. But Genesis 1 kind of layers on top of that as a later addition.
All right, so we're gonna wrap up tonight. I really appreciate this time together. So we, just a little bit of a highlight. We talked a little bit about how we kind of got here in this kind of fight about how to read the Bible and where that came from. I hope that was enlightening in some ways. And then we practiced a little bit about these other ways of reading the scriptures. Next class, and all the other classes moving forward, we're essentially going to be doing two things. We're going to be, looking at individual texts and kind of practicing some of these different ways of looking at the scriptures. We kind of started to do with Genesis 1 and 2. We're going to spend more time on that in the rest of the sections, and then we're going to touch a little bit on just other perspectives on the Bible. And our next class is going to be specifically around kind of how to look at the Bible from kind of an ecological perspective and some things we might learn from that. So. And if anyone has any questions or any thoughts or things that were confusing, I know it can sometimes be hard to bring up in a large group, let me know. I am going to be taking a break from, I'm still not 100%. I won't be working tomorrow, but I'll be sure to respond to all those questions on Sunday. And I'll send out a follow-up email right now with just a couple summary things and things we couldn't touch on. But I hope this was an interesting hour and a half, and I know I had a good. I love doing this so much more than writing annual report articles. I can promise you that immensely. So, yeah, cool. Alrighty, friends, I'm gonna turn the recording off.